This is the Expert Series. Dr. Leuprecht, thanks for accepting our invitation to speak on the podcast. Great to have you. Perhaps you could begin by providing some context for our listeners. Can you briefly explain some of the most crucial or significant events leading up to this week's report from David Johnston?
So as Canadians will be familiar, there's a host of questions that were asked about specifically interference in previous elections by an authoritarian, hostile state actor, that being China, and those allegations compounded in recent months. And the Prime Minister had a host of options to respond to this, including reports by the National Security Intelligence Committee of Parliamentarians from 2019 that laid out a host of options, a report by Dominic LeBlanc that laid out a host of options. But rather than pursuing any of those options, the Prime Minister chose to take action or avoid taking action on calls for transparency around the issues that had been alleged. And so the and his response to those allegations was to call what he describes as an independent special rapporteur to engage specifically with the question of whether a public inquiry is warranted and whether a public inquiry would be useful into this matter. There has been from the beginning, of course, questions raised about the independence of that rapporteur. If the rapporteur was to be independent, as I've stated repeatedly, one would have expected the Prime Minister to reach out to the opposition parties and to reach a consensus on who that individual might be. The Prime Minister opted not to do that and to appoint someone unilaterally, which necessarily left the impression of partiality, rightly or wrongly, from the outset. And the Prime Minister appointed someone with no prior expertise on national security matters, but someone who, at least in perception, on the one hand, had been seen close to the Trudeau family, and on the other hand, had decades of sympathetic and friendly relations with China. So we had a special rapporteur who was at least perceived as being not independent, close to the Prime Minister, and sympathetic to the point of perhaps a Sinophile in terms of his own predispositions. And the issue around that was, of course, that it colored from the beginning public perception on the likely outcome of the investigation itself that Mr. Johnston was going to conduct, irrespective of how he would go about conducting that investigation. So that, I guess, for the broader sort of context of the spectacle that we have been presented with over the past few days.
What are the potential drawbacks of not conducting a public inquiry into allegations of foreign interference in Canadian elections and society, as recommended by Special Rapporteur David Johnston? And what happens now?
Well, I think we might ask how he arrived at that conclusion. So I think there's two key elements to that. One is he construed his mandate as narrowly as possible. That is to say, the case that myself and others have made for public inquiry was precisely to have a broader sense of activities in place and whether our national security posture, in particular when it comes to foreign interference in general, but interference in our election, is sufficiently robust. Instead, Mr. Johnston interpreted his mandate as narrowly as possible, taking effectively the allegations that had been leveled in reporting by the Globe and Mail and by Global News, and appears to have gone to the agencies, to the Privy Council office, to the Prime Minister's office, and perhaps a few other folks, and asked them whether they believe those allegations to be true and accurate or not. And we know the answer that he got. We can take him at his word and say that he did his job thoroughly, or we can see this as a tautology where the findings were a foregone conclusion. The other surprising element about the way Mr. Johnston interpreted his mandate is, of course, that the allegations about interference disproportionately affected, if you want, in quotation marks, one victim. That is to say, the Conservative Party and some of their candidates. It's important to state that the leaders, both present and previous of the Conservative Party, have never delegitimized the election or its outcome per se. Rather, they've raised concerns about a number of their candidates and some of the practices that were alleged. Yet, Mr. Johnston appears not to have made an effort. You would think that if you're having this sort of investigation, the first thing you'd want to do is you want to talk to the, in quotation marks, victim. You want to talk to the people who feel that they have been harmed and get their perception of matters, in part so you could then make a case that perhaps they misperceived the issues, they misinterpreted, or that the facts just simply don't line up with the way that they see the world. Yet, if statements by the former leader of the Conservative Party are to be believed, and there's no reason why we shouldn't, given that he has made these statements in public and in writing, Mr. Johnston came to him last. It gave him 2 days' notice. And by the time Mr. Johnston showed up in his office, it was clear that the report was already in translation. So the report had already been finalized. In other words, it is clear that Mr. Johnston had no interest in engaging with the perspective of the alleged victims in this supposed foreign interference in our democratic institutions. So on the one hand, then we have a rapporteur who, at least in public perception, is not independent, is friendly to China, is friendly to the Prime Minister, and who wouldn't give the alleged victim an opportunity to voice their concerns and the evidence that they had gathered. At that point, we have to ask, how serious really is this entire undertaking? And was it really a fatuous exercise, simply trying to reinforce a narrative? I also have serious concerns about the method that Mr. Johnston used. Having read the report and the little bit that we can infer from the method, it appears that there is substantial amounts of confirmation bias in the report. And it would also appear that usual methods of social science inquiry, especially qualitative inquiry, were not followed. And so as far as I can read the report, if that had been submitted in my second year social science methods class, the report would not have passed muster. But we can only hope that perhaps in the interest of time, Mr. Johnston didn't feel it necessary to lay out the lengths to which he went to, and that perhaps my impression is wrong, and that perhaps when we receive a fuller accounting of his work in the fall, Mr. Johnston will do what any good professor should do and clearly lay out his method and demonstrate that his method is actually robust in terms of the to justify and rationalize the conclusions and findings that he reached, rather than constructing a conclusion based on the findings and evidence that happened to tautologically feed into preconceived notions of what the preferred narrative would have been from the people that tasked him with this exercise in the first place.
What measures do you think can be taken to address the serious gaps identified in the way intelligence is communicated from security agencies to government departments?
Yeah, look, I think that's a great question. And it's surprising that, yes, on the one hand, Mr. Johnston finds this as a serious fault. On the other hand, you would think that Mr. Johnston, as a former Governor General, would have pointed out that our Westminster parliamentary system is premised on the concept of ministerial responsibility, where ultimately ministers are responsible for their departments and what happens in their departments. And yet, of course, we know that in this particular government, when things go pear-shaped, there's been a predisposition to blaming the civil service rather than the minister taking responsibility. What is transpiring here are relations within the government's, the prime minister's own department, that is to say the Privy Council office, where there may have been alleged breakdowns in communication, in paperwork, and perhaps also breakdowns in the communication between the Privy Council office and the Prime Minister's office. Now, regardless of whether there was a breakdown or not, ultimately it means what Mr. Johnston's finding is that the prime minister needs to take responsibility for what happened here, because if there was a breakdown, as Mr. Johnston finds, then it's ultimately the prime minister who's responsible for his department. And yet so far, I have seen no willingness by the prime minister to actually take responsibility for what is transpiring in his department and keep on blaming everybody but himself. And I find this a little bit puzzling, because this is a government that came to power saying they were going to do business differently, on which they were elected. And yet this is the most centralized government in terms of decision making that this country has ever known. And so when things go wrong, then surprisingly, it seems to be everybody else's fault except for the prime minister and his extremely centralized decision making. And so in my view, we can't sort of have it both ways. That on the one hand, we want to make all the decisions, but then in the end, we're not responsible for any of the decisions. And when things go wrong, it's everybody else's fault. And so I think at some point here, the government actually needs to be held to account simply on the principles of the actual findings of Mr. Johnston, that in terms of ministerial responsibility and the response we've gotten so far from the government are deeply troubling in terms of the government not living up to its basic Westminster parliamentary constitutional responsibilities.
Dr. Leuprecht, you've been great. As we close out this interview, I'm wondering if you have any final words or final thoughts to impart on our audience.
So one might ask why it is that Mr. Johnston let himself be dragged into this mess to begin with. This is a man who had an exceptionally distinguished career, Harvard educated, the youngest dean of law at McGill University, very successfully ran two of the most distinguished universities in the country, McGill and Waterloo, became governor general. Why would he let himself be drawn into what was clearly, in the way it was set up, a rather partisan and partial undertaking from the outset? Why did he not frame this as that if he was going to get involved, it was going to be on the premise of, on the one hand, maximizing his legitimacy in terms of buy-in from the opposition, and on the other hand, making sure that he interprets his mandate as broadly as necessary rather than as narrowly as possible. And so what I find puzzling here is that, of course, we have a senior distinguished gentleman from the Laurentian elites who effectively, if you look at the people who are being defended, is defending a host of other white males, all of whom are also associated with the Laurentian elites, everyone from the prime minister to previous liberal ambassadorial appointments to China, whether that's John McCallum or Dominic Barton. And so I find it a little bit surprising that for a government that makes such a big deal about EDI and diversity and so forth, that what this report ultimately reinforces for me is white privilege. And that this report was ultimately about white male privileged elites, Laurentian elites in this country, when they were being asked to be transparent and accountable to the Canadian public, finding for themselves that there's nothing to see here and nothing to investigate here. And that certainly the Canadian public should not be asking any questions about the elites and how they've been running both this government and their relationships with China over the last 40 years. And so, if nothing else, I find a considerable dissonance here between the narrative that this government likes to put out in terms of its inclusivity, and that when it is ultimately challenged on the way things are done, it is quite happy to protect and defend its own white male privilege without accountability, transparency to the Canadian public.
Dr. Leuprecht, thank you for providing such astute analysis. Looking forward to having you on again in the future. Take care.